Today, we've got a story about witchcraft from Tennessee. I hope it rings a bell. I'm Aidan Mattis, and welcome to the Lore Lodge. In 1804, John Bell moved with his family to Robertson County, Tennessee. They started a small farm in what is now Adams, Tennessee, and everything for the first decade and a half was going pretty well. Again, they moved in 1804, and nothing really started happening to them until 1817. But when 1817 hit, just about everything that could possibly go wrong for the Bell family began to go wrong. Things started, as they always do, with strangeness regarding animals. It started when John Bell himself, the patriarch of the family, saw what he described as a misshapen black hound out in the cornfield. It was a dog with the head of a rabbit, and this disturbed him, so he shot at it and it ran off. Now, hopefully this would just be the end, but sadly, it wasn't. A member of his family staff, because this was 1817, of course, and slavery was still a thing, a member of his staff, one of the women, I believe, one of the maids, reported that she had seen a giant disfigured bird flying over the property, and one of the slaves of the Bell family reported seeing a large black and disconcertingly appearing dog. So a number of strange animal appearances start this cascade of events. And it's worth mentioning that black dogs and black wolves are very common in Western European folklore as harbingers of doom. So the Bell family, being Western Europeans themselves, would likely have had an understanding of what this would mean in a cultural context. A black dog's appearance generally meant either you were in trouble, your family was in trouble, or it could go so far as to be that that black dog itself, for example, in the Welsh tradition, the gwychri, will just rip you to shreds if it sees you. In the English tradition, black shuck is more of a harbinger of doom, but the point is you have a lot of Anglo-Saxon and Celtic stories of black dogs that imply that something bad is about to happen to you, and that seems to be exactly what was going on here. And then, of course, after the appearances of these strange animals, the very next thing to start happening was that they started hearing knocking on doors and outside of windows all around the outside of the house. Bell and his children, I believe there were 7 of them. It might have been 6. But the people living in this house were John Bell, his wife, and their 6 or 7 kids, a number of boys and a number of girls. Some of the main characters here are going to be Richard Bell and Betsy Bell, one of the sons and one of the daughters. And that's just important to keep in mind as we go deeper into this story. The next escalation after the set of knockings and rappings outside of the house was that the boys in their bedroom started to hear a number of what we might call auditory apparitions. So they reported the sound of rats gnawing at the bedposts. They said they heard the sound of dogs fighting, and perhaps the most disconcerting of all, the sound of chains dragging across the floor. Now, anytime they would go to investigate any of these strange sounds, as soon as they would light a candle or something, the sounds would stop. So whatever was going on, it did not like light. They did not notice these things during the day. So anytime a candle was lit or a lantern, even if there wasn't electricity, you would have at least some sort of light source. And when these were extinguished, the happenings would occur again. Now, at this point in the story, you might think, oh, well, things at least go away when the lights come on. But it goes from apparitions and noises and just strange things that are disconcerting but not necessarily a physical problem to very legitimate physical problems. John Bell started to develop facial twitches, paralysis. He said that he felt as though there was a stick inside of his mouth at a perpendicular angle to his tongue that was holding his cheeks apart like this. So this would be very uncomfortable. I would not appreciate this every day of my life. He had trouble swallowing, his tongue felt like it didn't fit right in his mouth, and eventually those twitches that had started in his face spread to the rest of his body. And now, if you're at all into toxicology, this all may sound a little bit familiar to you, because all of these are symptoms of heavy metal poisoning, or certain chemicals. One of the ones that was commonly suggested was, oh, well, it was probably lead. But if it were lead, then John probably would have recovered, because he didn't seem to have been poisoned with enough lead to kill him, and the lethal dose for lead is, I believe, 21 grams. What is more likely is that a very common rat poison of the time, arsenic, was likely the culprit, assuming, that is, that it was not witchcraft. Now, this is one of the parts of the story that I want to emphasize has a rational explanation. His convulsions, his problems, those could all have been symptoms of arsenic poisoning. Now, we don't have confirmation that he was suffering from arsenic poisoning starting in 1817, but we do know that when he died in 1820, there were absolutely signs of arsenic poisoning. Most importantly, there was a glass vial that they found in John Bell's room that contained a cloudy liquid that was dark in color, and when they fed it to the family cat, it killed the cat. Now, the reason it killed the cat so fast but wouldn't kill John Bell immediately if it was arsenic is that the way that humans and cats metabolize arsenic is different. They don't metabolize it at all. It just goes straight into their blood and kills them. With humans, it actually gets filtered out by our liver, and so it requires a much higher dose and often higher consistency in order to take a negative effect like death. But the rest of the problems John Bell was experiencing do sound like they could have been arsenic poisoning. Now, in 1817, when all of this started to occur, the Bells wanted to keep it a secret. This was very unseemly for that period. You didn't want to tell people that you were suffering from some sort of supernatural or paranormal occurrence. Not because people were less superstitious than they are now. In fact, they were far more superstitious. But because if you were the victim of witchcraft, it was going to make people avoid you. They didn't know if it was your fault. They didn't know if you were actually the one doing it and you were just trying to displace the blame. So people, if they found out that you were having a witchcraft problem, were probably going to keep you at arm's length. But eventually all of this came to a head and they were unable to keep it a secret any longer. So they invited their neighbors, the Johnstons, to stay the night and had a nice little sleepover. This chapter of the story is the illustrious Bell-Johnston slumber party of 1818. So, the Johnstons and the Bells had a nice dinner, they had some discussion, everything was going according to plan, everything was going great, and then they all went to bed, and that's when things start to get hairy. The first thing that happened was, as soon as the lights in the house, the candles and whatnot, were extinguished, they started hearing the noises, and the Johnstons heard it too. Now, to be clear, Bell had told the Johnstons something was going on, but to my understanding, he did not tell them exactly what was going on. Just that something was strange and he wanted them to come over for a night and see if they experienced it too. And they sure as hell did, because there were noises, there was whispering, there was, at some point in the night they said that they believed that something came into their room. Now, this was a physical entity according to them, but it was not a visible physical entity. So some sort of force came into the room and according to the Johnstons, ripped the bedding off of their bed while they were in it. So, after this experience, what Johnston did was, he said, no, you should tell everyone. I communicated with it. You should tell everyone. This is an entity that needs to be heard. And so, reluctantly, Bell went along with it, and the end result of this was that people from all over the county of Robertson started coming over to the Bell household to interact with this entity, to ask it questions, and to commune with it, which, if you know anything about demonology, is a horrible, terrible idea because it's just going to give the thing more energy and more power as more and more people pay attention to it. Which, if this is what was going on, it seems very much like whatever this presence was intelligent and was deliberately manipulating the Bells and the Johnstons in order to gain more power. And that becomes very clear very quickly because the next thing that happened was that the witch, so to speak, the entity, started speaking. And it started speaking because people were coming to the house and praying for the Bells. And then the entity started to join in the prayers. And according to people who came to the house and the writings of Richard Bell, one of John Bell's sons, according to him, people came to the house and would communicate with the being, with the entity, and when they did, it started to talk even more. It started to have complex theological discussions with pastors and holy men who would come to interact with it. And just over time, it had the kind of the opposite of what we normally associate with things from other realms, the evil spirits of the world. Usually prayer, whether it be Christian or non-Christian, prayer is generally supposed to weaken them or to bother them or to banish them. In this case, it seems that the entity, whatever it was, enjoyed the prayer and enjoyed the discussion, had a good time talking with these pastors and these holy men. So it's very strange. That's out of place. And it's why the more I read into this story, the more I did my research, the less I was thinking witchcraft. Witchcraft made less and less sense the longer this went on. What made a hell of a lot more sense to me personally was a demonic entity, but we'll get into that. Now, when the entity first spoke, it did something very deliberate and very distinct. It recited the prayer that Johnston himself had recited that first night that it communicated with him, in his voice, from nowhere. Everyone in the room just heard it talking. But the longer that this whole praying thing went on, the more people started to get skeptical. Why was this entity, why was this being that had ostensibly for so long been terrorizing the Bell family, why was it now interested in playing nice? And as people started to feel this way more and more, the veil dropped. The entity began describing itself as a spirit from everywhere. It was in the air, it was from heaven, it was from hell, and it wanted to kill John. That was its specific goal. It wanted to kill John Bell. And the thing is, the more people communicated with, the more they asked questions, the more it kind of confused things and muddied the waters. At one point, the spirit claimed that there had been a Native American burial ground on the Bell's land that was disturbed, and it was the spirit of a Native American boy. At another point, it said that it was the spirit of a wealthy immigrant who had buried treasure on the land, and since the treasure had gone undiscovered, it was trying to tell people where it was. There was the fact that it said it was millions of years old at a time when people didn't really believe the Earth to be millions of years old. They believed, for the most part, that it was some collection of thousands of years old. Now, for this entity to be saying, I'm from heaven and hell and everywhere, and I'm also millions of years old, that definitely pushes things more towards the demonic side. But what people really latched onto was not demonology, it was not entities, it was not experiences like that. It was the fact that one thing that the ghost said, the entity said, was that it was the witchcraft creation of one of their neighbors, Kate Batts, that Kate Batts was a witch, and that she had cursed the Bell family and was torturing them with this entity that she summoned from another world, which, again, assuming that that's actually what it said to them and not just something John Bell made up because he and Kate Batts were in some sort of economic dispute, which I know they were, and this is in the court records of the time. But if it were something where it was saying it was the witch of Kate Batts, which is, to my understanding, how it described itself, it doesn't make a ton of sense that Batts would be appearing in another form or projecting, so to speak. What it sounds like to me, based on, again, what this says, is that we're dealing with, if let's say Batts was a witch, that she summoned something, that she summoned a demon. Not that she was going and doing this herself, but rather she had brought something into the world to terrorize the Bell family. Regardless, people began referring to the witch as Kate, much to the chagrin of Kate Batts. She was not happy about this, and she lived the rest of her life under the suspicion that she was actually a witch, which got her ostracized from a lot of community-related events. Sometime between 1817 and 1820, Betsy Bell, one of John's daughters, became engaged to Joshua Gardner, one of the neighbors. And it seems that the Bell Witch did not take kindly to this. This entity started scratching and poking Betsy with pins and bothering her with horrific noises and whisperings, and it just kind of terrorized her and tormented her, and its goal seemed to be to get her to break off this engagement with Joshua Gardner. And it didn't stop. It just kept going for 3 years, until eventually in 1821, Betsy, distraught over the fact that she just was not able to escape this thing, found that the best option she had was to end the engagement. And as far as the record goes, that is when the Bell Witch stopped causing a problem, and that's because it also achieved its other goal in 1820, which was to kill John Bell. John Bell died, ostensibly of poisoning. The witch, the entity, claimed credit for it, and while it's possible that he was poisoned by a member of his family or one of his slaves, or even just an enemy from somewhere in town, it did get pinned on the witch. And there's enough aspects of this story that are explainable to kind of write them off, but at the end of the day, there are some aspects that don't make a ton of sense. Everyone in this family reported hearing the apparitions. Everyone in this family saw something strange on the property. They all heard the knocking on the doors. All of them reported interacting with the entity. We have people who are not in the family who reportedly interacted with the entity. And there's a journal from an army captain, oddly enough named John Bell, who was a different John Bell entirely, who traveled all the way from the Great Plains back to Tennessee so that he could go and see Betsy and see how she was communicating with this otherworldly spirit. Because apparently this was actually something that had become rather well known. John Bell traveled all the way from the Dakotas to Tennessee just to witness this. And, according to legend, even President Andrew Jackson came to see, even though he was not president at the time. At the time, he was just a general in the U.S. Army. So, Jackson supposedly came to interact with the witch, and one of his soldiers supposedly shot at it with a silver bullet, but all of this seems to be apocryphal. There's no real evidence of it outside of Richard Bell's writings. I feel like a visit by Andrew Jackson at this time probably would have gotten better coverage, although it's not entirely improbable that Jackson would have visited Bell's property because the Jacksons owned property near the Bells, and considering they were all wealthy landowners, it would make sense for them to know each other. But at the end of the day, we don't have a ton of evidence that that ever actually occurred. So, of course, in 1820, John Bell dies. In 1821, Betsy Bell breaks off her engagement, and the Bell Witch seems to die down for a little while. Nobody else really reports problems with it, although the property itself continues to have a odd feeling to it. And the Bell family, to this day, they're still kicking. Obviously not any of these individuals, but they've passed down all the stories through their family. They take it seriously, and the locals of the area also take it seriously. And of course, a movie was made out of this, a book was made out of this. But what I want to go over just for the end of this video is my theories on what this could be. Because the obvious theory is witchcraft. Kate Batts was playing with spirits. Now, it's also possible that John Bell himself was the witch and summoned something he didn't know how to handle, and he ended up blaming it on Kate. Or it was another family member, or it was one of the slaves on the property. You never know. There's a million possibilities for witchcraft in this scenario. But the things that happen don't quite fit with witchcraft alone. It doesn't sound like just hexing somebody or something like that. What this sounds like is a demonic infestation, but at the same time, a demonic infestation does not rule out witchcraft, because a witch could summon a demon and bind it and have it do its bidding. So that brings me to my next one, which is a demonic entity. Why would there be a demonic entity in western Tennessee? I don't really know. But it does sound like it was there, because everything here fits with that. You've got strange noises, strange apparitions, strange smells. You've got symptoms that can't be explained. You've got something that, most importantly out of all of this, seemed to have a good, solid grasp on Christian theology, which is not something that your average witch would have. So it makes sense under the circumstances of this thing saying that it is from heaven, hell, and the earth, that is in the air, and that it is millions of years old. That all sounds extraordinarily demonic to me. That fits point for point with Judeo-Christian demonology. Other possibilities. It could have been a ghost, or a number of ghosts. Again, this is a property where slaves lived and died. I would not be surprised if a few of them weren't super happy with those circumstances and stuck around a little while just to bother the Bells. That said, ghosts killing people is rather rare in non-horror movie depictions of ghosts. People rarely report dying to these things unless it was something like being pushed. They don't really seem to cause illness. And I've certainly never heard of a ghost poisoning somebody. Now, there was, of course, the possibility that it was cursed land. There are apocryphal stories that after the colonists came in and settled the territory, which had formerly belonged to the Cherokee people, that the Native Americans cursed the land, and maybe Bell just happened to wander onto a specific spot that was very cursed. Or there's, of course, the possibility of Native American witchcraft, aka something along the lines of a skinwalker. And even though we're outside of the southwestern United States here, while the Navajo skinwalker tradition is the best known, it's not the only one. And there were other tribes that practiced similar rituals across the southern United States. And is it possible that a Cherokee skinwalker existed? It's not out of the question. It might not fit within the, modern version or even the recorded version of the lore, but it's entirely possible. These were all peoples practicing similar shamanistic religions, if not exactly the same, so they all would have had rituals, and they entirely possibly could have had rituals that were reflections or that they had traded with one another. And when you take into account the strange-looking bird and the dog with the head of a rabbit and the scary black hound with the glowing yellow eyes, those all do sound a little bit like skinwalker stories to me. So that's another possibility. But personally, I still fall very much on the side that this was one of two things. Either it was a hoax or it was a demon. Either way, I think it's a fascinating story, and I would love to go check it out. This is one of America's most prominent ghost stories, and I think that's super interesting. and I'd like to know your thoughts. So if you have thoughts, if you have a story related to this, if you're from Tennessee, go ahead and leave a comment. Let us know what you think, and we will happily read through all of them. And if we like one particularly, we'll even pin it. If you have a good story, we'll pin it so everybody gets to read because we love you. And also because we love you, please smash the like button, notification bell, subscribe. I don't know, my brain just broke for a second there. Smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and if you want more content, check us out on Patreon, TikTok, and Instagram. I'm Aidan Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge. Today, we've got a story about witchcraft from Tennessee. I hope it rings a bell. I'm Aidan Mattis, and welcome to the Lore Lodge. You get it, because it's about the Bell Witch?
Yeah.
That's a good one, right?
Yeah, I see what you did.
that little bit should go in at the end.
Yes.
Just like...
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. In 1804,